Are Republicans starting a coup to keep Donald Trump in the White House? Plus, the biggest Trump rally ever? Welcome to America Uncovered. I'm Chris Chappell. Republicans, like Senator Ted Cruz, are challenging the presidential election results. But first, we need your help. YouTube isn't showing people our videos and is demonetizing us. Help us fight back by liking and sharing this episode. It helps us with the algorithm. And support the show on patreon.com/America Uncovered. So, if you haven't been paying attention, or only listening to a small number of mainstream media outlets, you would have no idea there's been any challenge to Biden's victory. But this week, a potentially big challenge to the election will happen, and Trump is calling on all his supporters to be there for it in D.C. Tomorrow, January 6th, is when Congress counts and certifies the Electoral College votes for president. Most years, this is ceremonial. However, this year, the Trump campaign has alleged a conspiracy of election fraud robbed him of the presidency. There's been ongoing lawsuits, more than 60 making this case, but most have been thrown out on procedural grounds. Either the lawsuits were submitted too early, too late, the courts didn't have the jurisdiction, the plaintiffs didn't have legal standing, etc. Basically, the evidence has never been heard in court. On Sunday, the Washington Post published this exclusive article suggesting that in a phone call, Trump pressured Georgia's Secretary of State to recalculate the vote in his favor, which turned into headlines about how Trump told an official to steal the election, which meant that Trump could have broken the law, according to some lawyers, which is worse than Watergate, according to famous Watergate reporter Carl Bernstein, which all sounds really bad. Although Bernstein has also called Trump's interview with Bob Woodward worse than Watergate. And he also called the Russia probe worse than Watergate. And just Trump's presidency in general worse than Watergate. So to Carl Bernstein, pretty much everything involving Trump is worse than Watergate. Even Trump's hair is worse than Watergate. But it's a catchy headline. Now, after the Washington Post broke this story and set this news cycle in motion, they eventually released the full recording and transcript of the call between Trump and Georgia's Secretary of State. And if you listen to the full call, it's not quite what the headlines say. In fact, it's not at all what the headlines say. The Washington Post might have instead called the article, "Trump points to 9 ways Georgia election may have been rigged. Asks Secretary of State to release data," which is yet another good reminder that you should never get your news from just reading headlines. At any rate, tomorrow, during the congressional session, Trump says massive amounts of evidence will be presented.
Massive amounts of evidence will be presented on the 6th. We won big.
He also called on all his supporters to be there in D.C. while it happens.
Big protest in D.C. on January 6th. Be there, will be wild.
Ever since 2020 began, everything's been wild. I would like just one day where things are normal. That would be wild. So how wild will this rally be? So far, D.C. has approved 3 separate permits, a total of about 15,000 people. But we have no idea how many people may actually show up. According to the Washington Post, a campaign to urge downtown hotels to shut their doors during this week's events is ongoing, although largely unsuccessful. Yeah, hotels are not going to shut their doors to paying customers after a year of losing business to coronavirus lockdowns. However, there is one hotel that will close, the Hotel Harrington, D.C.'s longest-running hotel. The hotel said it would be closed January 4th through 6th. It follows this hit piece from the Washington Post describing it as the go-to hotel for the Proud Boys. D.C. officials are not fans of the Proud Boys. The mayor said these Proud Boys are avowed white nationalists and have been called to stand up against a fair and legal election. And for this rally, the Proud Boys have said they're going incognito. We will not be wearing our traditional black and yellow. We will be incognito, and we will spread across downtown D.C. in smaller teams. That's according to the white supremacist leader of the Proud Boys, Enrique Tarrio. Okay, I know he's Afro-Cuban, but the media says he's a white supremacist, which makes it true. So there will be a big Trump rally in D.C. But why would the Trump campaign be able to present evidence now, when for the past several months they haven't been able to get a court to hear it? I'll explain after this short commercial break. Welcome back. Unless YouTube demonetized us, and this was all very awkward. So you might be wondering, why does Trump think he'll get to present evidence now if he hasn't been able to get a court to hear the evidence? Well, here's Trump's advisor, Jason Miller, speaking on Newsmax about their plan.
The counting of the electoral votes on January 6th is the final backstop. This is when Congress goes and actually takes the votes that came out of each of the states. And now keep in mind, in some of the states where we have disputes, we do have multiple slates of electors. And if it comes up and there are concerns with fraud and irregularity, then you can have a member of the House who can object to a particular state's electors. You can have a member of the Senate that would need to second that. And then there'd be 2 hours where the respective bodies would debate this and then come back and deal with it.
This process to challenge the electoral vote is part of the U.S. Constitution. But there's a problem with what Miller calls multiple slates of electors. As I've talked about in recent episodes, it is possible for a state's governor and legislature to submit different slates of votes, what's called dueling electors. But in this election, the alternate slate of electors for Trump were sent in by the Republican Party, not the governor or legislature. So would Congress even recognize them? Well, that's not clear. But to open a debate on the issue, all it requires is one member of the House and one member of the Senate to call into question the official state electoral results. And dozens of members of the House have said they will do that. But what about the Senate? Senate Republican leader Mitch McConnell has been warning others not to do it or there could be a brawl. And the number 2 senator said the challenge would go down like a shot dog. Well, that's folksy. Look, I don't know what Senator John Thune does in South Dakota, but here in New York, we say it'll go down like a rat run over by the D train. Still, at least 12 Republican senators, including Ted Cruz, have said they will make the challenge. And Vice President Mike Pence, as the president of the Senate, said he welcomes it. So congratulations, America. We've finally reached a consensus. Both the left and the right agree. There's a coup attempt going on. They both think the other side is trying to steal the election. In a joint statement, 11 of those Republican senators explain why they are making the challenge. They point to a poll which says that 39% of Americans believe the election was rigged. That belief is held by 67% of Republicans, 17% of Democrats, and 31% of independents. And they say because such an enormous number of Americans think the election was rigged, steps should be taken to truly settle the election results once and for all. Whether or not our elected officials or journalists believe it, that deep distrust of our democratic processes will not magically disappear. It should concern us all, and it poses an ongoing threat to the legitimacy of any subsequent administrations. Since courts have refused to hear the evidence of election fraud, these senators suggest Congress should immediately appoint an electoral commission with full investigatory and fact-finding authority to conduct an emergency 10-day audit of the election returns in the disputed states. Once completed, individual states would evaluate the commission's findings and could convene a special legislative session to certify a change in their vote if needed. The senators also say, "We intend to vote on January 6th to reject the electors from disputed states as not regularly given and lawfully certified unless and until that emergency 10-day audit is completed." Now, is that an assault on American democracy? Well, they point out that Democrats have done this as well. There is long precedent of Democratic members of Congress raising objections to presidential election results, as they did in 1969, 2001, 2005, and 2017. And back in 1877, after an electoral college dispute between Republican Rutherford B. Hayes and Democrat Samuel J. Tilden, Congress created a bipartisan electoral commission to investigate disputed states. After 25 days, the commission came back with their report. They found that in 3 states, both Democratic and Republican officials were guilty of fraud, lying, and attempts at bribery to swing the election. Congress convened again, argued for a week, and eventually elected Hayes, even though Hayes had initially looked like he had lost the Electoral College. And today, tens of millions of Americans believe there was election fraud. For example, before the election, almost every major media outlet was warning voting machines could be hacked, from the Washington Post to CBS to the New York Times. In that New York Times article, they specifically said a hacker could flip votes for Trump to Biden. But now, the narrative has changed. Now there's no possible way there could have been voter fraud. The only acceptable narrative allowed in the mainstream media is that there absolutely was no problem and no one is allowed to question the election. So, is an emergency 10-day audit of the election returns really that bad of an idea? Democrats should support an investigation because it's the only way they can convince tens of millions of Americans that Biden is the legitimate winner. If there was no election fraud, Biden will be our next president, and Americans will know our election system is more or less secure. However, if the results come back differently, then 2021 is going to be as much of a train wreck as 2020. A lot of rats could go down under the D train. But Congress could just decide not to open any kind of election commission at all. After all, it would take a majority of senators and representatives for a challenge to the electoral results to be upheld. And since the Democrats control the House and Senator McConnell disapproves of the challenge, that's unlikely. We'll just have to wait and see. Stay tuned to America Uncovered for updates. You can also follow me on Instagram, Twitter, and Parler. Once again, I'm Chris Chappell. Thanks for watching America Uncovered.